it was a great movie, but it seemed like there was resistance to that
Picture
movie.
this. Joe Rogan, the man who has sat across from presidents, war veterans, whistleblowers, comedians, and the wildest thinkers alive on this planet. A man who never loses his cool. A man who has made a career out of pushing back, asking the hard question and never letting anything slide unchallenged.
To that movie.
Mel Gibson was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ.
What if
now
the most
picture that man going completely, utterly, breathlessly silent. Not the polite silence of someone waiting for their turn to speak. Not the awkward silence of someone who has run out of things to say. We are talking about the kind of silence that falls over a room when something enormous and real has just landed. The kind of silence you cannot fake and you cannot manufacture. The kind that grabs you by the chest and squeezes. That is what happened. That is the moment you need to understand before anything else. When Mel Gibson sat down across from Rogan and started pulling back the curtain on what actually happened during the creation of The Passion of the Christ, something shifted in that studio. And whatever Rogan was expecting that day, it was not this. Because what Gibson revealed was not gossip, not controversy for the sake of headlines, and not a promotional tour talking point. It was something far more unsettling than any of that. By the time this video is over, you are going to look at that film and that conversation in a way you have never looked at them before. I promise you that. But real quick before we dive in, if you are new around here, hit that subscribe button right now. We go deep on the stories that most channels never bother to dig into. Like this video, share it with someone who would appreciate it, and tell me in the comments whether you ever saw The Passion of the Christ and what it did to you. I read every single comment, everyone. Now, let us go back to where this insane story actually begins. Let us set the scene. It is the early 2000s. Mel Gibson is not some struggling independent filmmaker begging for a table. He is an Oscar winner. He directed Braveheart. He is one of the biggest names in Hollywood. His word alone should open every door in the industry. So, when Gibson starts developing a new project, every studio in town should be throwing money at him. Except something extraordinary happened. The moment they heard what the project was, the doors did not just close. They slammed shut, hard. The project was a film about the final 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life, shot entirely in Aramaic and Latin, with subtitles. No A-list Hollywood cast, no marketable franchise built around it, just raw, brutal, uncompromising storytelling about the crucifixion. And the industry collectively looked at Mel Gibson and said, absolutely not. Phone calls went dead. Meetings that had been scheduled suddenly vanished from calendars. Colleagues who had worked alongside him for decades started finding reasons to be busy. The message being sent could not have been clearer if they had written it in the sky. This story is not welcome here, and neither are you for wanting to tell it. Gibson has spoken about this directly. He noticed a pattern running through the entertainment industry that most people inside it never say out loud. Films exploring all kinds of faith traditions receive careful, nuanced, respectful handling. Stories rooted in Christianity, specifically stories that took the theology seriously and refused to soften it, were treated as embarrassing relics, old-fashioned, out of touch, commercially dead. He described Christianity as the one tradition that Hollywood had quietly decided you were allowed to mock and dismiss, while everything else demanded sensitivity and respect. So Gibson did something extraordinary, something that almost no filmmaker at his level of success has ever done. He pulled out his own wallet. He financed the entire film himself, $30 million of his own money on a story the entire industry had told him nobody wanted to see. He built a team of people who believed in what they were making, people who were not scared off by the opposition. And together they set out to make something that would be impossible to ignore. The gamble was almost suicidal by Hollywood standards. What happened next changed everything, and the part of the story nobody talks about enough is coming up right after this. Here is what you need to understand about the Passion of the Christ before we go any further. This film was never designed to make you comfortable. Gibson did not sit down and say, let us make a pleasant, religious epic that people can enjoy on a Sunday afternoon. That was never the intention. Gibson spent years, not weeks, years, studying every verse across all four Gospels that touched the final hours of Jesus' life. He went beyond the biblical text and dug into historical accounts of Roman crucifixion, early theological writings, and ancient sources that most mainstream filmmakers would never have the patience or the obsession to explore. He wanted to understand not just what happened, but what it weighed, what it actually cost. The result is a film that opens in the Garden of Gethsemane at night, darkness pressing in from every direction, Jesus kneeling alone, in prayer while the people closest to him are asleep on the ground around him. The vulnerability in those early scenes is almost unbearable to watch. You feel the aloneness. You feel the weight of what is coming. Gibson stages it so that you cannot look at the screen casually. He forces you in, and then the symbolism starts layering in. A serpent moves through the garden. A heel comes down and crushes it. In one image, Gibson is calling back to the very first promise of redemption written in Genesis. Every single frame of this film was built to carry meaning. Nothing is decoration. The violence, yes, we have to address it. The violence in this film is extreme, and it is intentional. Gibson has said clearly that he wanted audiences to face what crucifixion actually was, not the cleaned-up gold cross hanging on a church wall version. The historical Roman version, which was specifically designed to maximize humiliation and suffering over the longest possible period of time before death finally arrived. There is no comfortable distance in this film. Gibson refuses to give it to you. That choice split audiences and critics straight down the middle. But it also forced something powerful to happen. It forced a conversation that American cinema almost never has, about what sacrifice genuinely means, about what suffering is actually for, about why any of this would matter if it were true. This was not passive viewing. This was cinema that reached through the screen and grabbed people by the collar, and Gibson built every second of it that way on purpose. Okay, here is where the story takes a turn that stopped Rogan in his tracks. And honestly, when you hear all of it laid out together, it is going to stop you too. Because making this film was not just professionally dangerous, according to Gibson, according to cast members, according to people who were on that set every single day. Making this film was something else entirely, something that defied ordinary explanation at multiple points. Start with Jim Caviezel, the actor cast as Jesus. What this man went through during production was not acting. It was not commitment to a role. It was something that crossed over into genuine physical suffering that no director would write into a contract. The cross that Caviezel carried during filming was not a prop cross. It weighed over 150 pounds, and during one take, the weight combined with the angle he was carrying it at caused his shoulder to dislocate completely out of the socket. A real injury, real pain, and he kept filming. During the scourging sequence, which is already one of the most harrowing things ever committed to film, he was struck by an actual whip with enough force to completely knock the air from his lungs. His hands were cut open and bleeding. What you see in that scene is not entirely performance. Some of it is a man actually in pain, and your body reads that different, without your brain having to process it consciously. Then there was the lightning. During filming, lightning struck near the set more than once in ways that the crew could not explain away. The assistant director was hit twice. Both times he walked away without serious injury, which by any statistical measure is extraordinary. Caviezel himself reportedly had a lightning incident during the crucifixion shoot, the single most symbolically charged moment in the entire production. He was unhurt. You can interpret that however you want to interpret it. Gibson himself is not going to tell you what to think. He tells you what happened and he leaves it there. But it does not stop with lightning. Luca Leonello, the actor who played Judas, walked onto that set as a declared atheist. He spent months inside the character of the man who betrayed Jesus, sitting inside themes of guilt and spiritual ruin and the weight of irreversible choices. By the time the last shot was wrapped, Leonello was no longer an atheist. He has spoken about the transformation publicly. Something about inhabiting that role in the context of this particular story changed him at a level he could not rationalize away. And then there are the healing accounts. People near the set. A child with severe epilepsy who went weeks without a seizure during the period of filming. Crew members who describe experiences they had no secular vocabulary for. Gibson presents all of this carefully. He is not preaching at you. He is not demanding you reach a theological conclusion. He is simply telling you that the line between what is natural and what is inexplicable felt dangerously thin throughout the making of this film. And the people who were there have never fully shaken that feeling. Rogan, who has made skepticism almost a personality trait, did not wave this away. He sat with it. And that tells you something. When The Passion of the Christ finally hit theaters in February of 2004, the response was something the industry had never quite seen before, and has not seen since. The numbers were jaw-dropping. A film made for $30 million with no traditional studio backing, shot in dead languages, with content that every executive in Hollywood had declared commercially unviable, went on to gross over $600 million worldwide. The studios that had turned Gibson away watched those numbers come in and had nothing to say. But the conversation surrounding the film was far bigger than box office figures. Before the film was even released, serious concerns were raised by religious scholars and leaders, including prominent Jewish theologians and academics, about how certain scenes depicted Jewish leaders in relation to the crucifixion. These were not trivial objections. The historical record of how passion narratives have been weaponized to justify horrific violence against Jewish communities stretches across centuries. Those scholars knew that history in their bones, and they were right to take the question seriously. Gibson maintained that his reading of the events placed responsibility on all of humanity collectively, not on any single group. That the film was about every one of us. Whether every viewer experienced it that way is a more complicated conversation. Roger Ebert, arguably the most respected film critic of his generation, awarded the film 4 stars. He wrote that he had never in his career truly reckoned with what crucifixion meant physically until he watched this film. From a man who had spent his entire life watching everything. That is not a small thing to say. Thoughtful critics praised the sincerity and the artistic ambition of what Gibson had built, while raising legitimate questions about scenes that drew from sources outside the biblical text. Gibson was always clear that he was making a theological work of art, not a historical documentary. Symbolism was always part of the language. The debate was real. It was sometimes heated, and it was almost entirely healthy. Art that matters makes people argue. It makes people sit in discomfort and dig into why something affected them the way it did. By every one of those measures, The Passion of the Christ did exactly what great cinema is supposed to do. Now we arrive at the moment in that interview that people keep returning to. The moment that actually changed the temperature of the room. At a certain point in the conversation, Gibson shifted. He stopped talking about the film and started talking about the historical event at the center of it. The resurrection, not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, not as something to be interpreted and adjusted for modern sensibilities, as a thing that allegedly happened, as a reported event that a group of real people in the 1st century claimed to have witnessed with their own eyes and then spent the rest of their lives, and in almost every case their deaths, insisting was real. And Gibson asked a question, simple on the surface but devastating underneath it. Who dies for something they know is a lie? The apostles were not martyred quietly. They were given opportunities, repeatedly, to walk things back, to say it was a misunderstanding, a legend that grew beyond what anyone intended, an honest mistake. Not one of them took that exit. Every single one died, insisting that they had personally witnessed a dead man walk out of a tomb. Gibson was not asking Rogan or the audience to simply accept that testimony. He was asking something harder and more honest than that. He was asking what you do with it. What framework do you use to account for that many people under that kind of pressure, dying for a claim they could have simply retracted? And Rogan, who builds his entire professional identity around not being a pushover, who interrogates every guest who comes into his studio, sat there and admitted that he found it genuinely difficult to dismiss. That is the moment. That is what everyone who watched that episode keeps coming back to. Not because Rogan became a Christian on camera, but because he was honest enough to say that the argument had weight he could not easily argue away. Gibson did not come onto that podcast just to look backward. He brought something with him, something that he has been building quietly for years, that almost nobody in the mainstream has paid attention to. For close to a decade, Gibson and Screenwriter Randall Wallace, the man who wrote Braveheart, had been developing something they describe as a follow-up to The Passion of the Christ, but calling it a sequel would completely misrepresent what they are actually attempting. The film centers on the resurrection, but Gibson's vision stretches so far beyond a single event that the scope of it is almost hard to hold in your head. He has described it as a narrative that spans from the fall of the angels all the way to the death of the last apostle. He is not making a chapter 2. He is attempting to place that single morning in Jerusalem within a cosmic context so vast that audiences will feel the full weight of what it means across all of recorded time. He called it the most ambitious project he has ever undertaken. Consider what that means, coming from the man who made Braveheart, Apocalypto, and Hacksaw Ridge. Those are not small films. If Gibson says this is bigger than all of them, you should believe him. He has spent years going back to the ancient texts and theological sources he explored for the original film, but pushing deeper into territories he had not touched before. Early church writings, historical accounts of the apostolic era, philosophical debates from the period immediately following the crucifixion. He is trying to build something that places the resurrection inside the largest possible story surrounding it. And he wants every single person in that theater to feel challenged. Believers who came in already certain, skeptics who think the whole thing is mythology. Gibson wants both of them to walk out with more genuine questions than they walked in with. That is an almost impossibly difficult thing to pull off. But as we have already established, Mel Gibson has never responded well to being told something is impossible. So let us step back and look at everything we have covered and ask what the real story is here. A filmmaker at the top of his career puts his own money, his own reputation, and his own relationships on the line for a story that every gatekeeper in Hollywood told him was worthless and unwanted. He builds the film anyway, against every prediction, against every piece of conventional industry wisdom. It becomes one of the biggest cultural events of the decade, and one of the highest-grossing films in its category of all time. While making it, things happen on set that the people who were there still cannot explain. An actor's shoulder dislocates and he keeps filming. A declared atheist comes out a believer. Lightning strikes in patterns that defy easy explanation, and nobody dies. Reports of healings, reports of experiences that the ordinary secular vocabulary of film production simply cannot contain. 20 years later, the same director sits across from one of the most aggressively skeptical interviewers on the planet and poses a single question. Who dies for something they know is a lie, and the skeptic cannot shake it? What Joe Rogan encountered in that conversation was not a sales pitch. It was not crisis management or reputation rehabilitation. It was something much rarer than either of those things. It was a man who had spent decades genuinely wrestling with the hardest questions a human being can ask, who had risked everything on the conviction that the answers to those questions mattered, and who had built a body of work from that conviction without ever softening it into something easier to sell. That is extraordinarily rare in any field. In Hollywood, it is almost without precedent. You do not have to agree with Gibson's conclusions. You do not have to share his faith or accept his theological framework. Those are your choices to make, and thoughtful people land in very different places on these questions. That is completely legitimate. But here is the thing that is very hard to argue with, regardless of where you stand. The story of someone absorbing the absolute worst that the world can do to a human being and responding not with bitterness or vengeance but with forgiveness is one of the most powerful ideas in the history of human thought. It moves people. It has always moved people. Across cultures and centuries and wildly different belief systems, it lands. Gibson's entire creative life, at its most honest and most unguarded, has been an attempt to make that idea impossible to walk past without feeling it. And whether you walked into the theater in 2004 as a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in the complicated middle ground most of us actually occupy, that impact was real. That conversation was real. And whatever questions it left you with are worth sitting with. That is the hidden truth behind The Passion of the Christ. It was never just a movie. It was a man deciding that some things are worth everything, and then proving it. Tell me what You think in the comments right now. Did you see The Passion of the Christ? What did it do to you? Are you curious about what Gibson is building next? I genuinely want to know where you land on this, because this is exactly the kind of conversation worth having. If this video gave you something, share it with someone. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. We go this deep on a regular basis, and you do not want to keep missing it. See you in the next one.